Sinking fund management for strata and commercial buildings. What we'll be looking at will be the sinking fund and its main components, and the history of sinking funds and the requirements of that in the industry around Australia, to give you a good idea on how these sinking funds come together and how they come about, I suppose. So this will give you a good insight on how these are prepared and what people look at when preparing one of these sinking funds. Alright, so when you own a unit, there's usually two funds that most people look at. One is your administration fund, which is your day-to-day expenditure, and also the sinking fund, what we'll be looking at, which is your big ticket items. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so what is a sinking fund? So a sinking fund is a detailed and comprehensive estimate of the council's corporate sinking fund expenditure for the next 10 years. That includes estimating of repainting of common property, and the buildings are owned by the body corporate. So if you look at maintaining your vehicle and servicing your car, you've got to do the same to the common property area and maintain that as if it was back in its original state. So that's the whole point of that sinking fund, and that from there. So there's a few components that are in the sinking fund what we need to look at. So we need to provide for the necessary and reasonable expenditure from the sinking fund for that financial year. Reserve a proportional amount to meet their anticipated expenditure over the next 9 years. And also you've got to take into account the anticipated expenditure of the capital nature, as well as the period replacement of these items of a major capital nature, and also other capital that should be reasonably met in that time period. So it gets a little bit confusing sometimes to work out what needs to go in and what doesn't, but we can look at that a little bit later on. Alright, so what we'll do, we'll go and have a look at the history of sinking funds and that around Australia at the moment. So in Queensland, it was originally introduced in 1987. This was looked at or coined by Leary and Partners. They were the first people to come into the industry to put together the sinking funds with that a lot of the legislation where that came about. You'll find there's a lot of this stuff in the retirement villages, stuff like that. So then it went into New South Wales in 2004 to 2006. Now this was introduced over a 3-year period because there was like 777,000 unit complexes in New South Wales. They thought this is going to be a bit difficult for us to implement this all in one hit, so they had that on a 3-stage approach. In the ACT, the sinking fund forecast was introduced in 2009, so that was a little bit later from the legislation from there. In Victoria, it was also brought in 2009, but only for units over $200,000 in turnover or 100 units in size. There's some trends now that the smaller units are now increasing, and they call it a maintenance plan in Victoria, and also in Tasmania's legislation it's done by the likes of the committee if they feel like doing one of those. So in WA, South Australia, Northern Territory, they call it a reserve fund forecast, and there's no legal requirements to have a forecast done in that period of time. So it's quite interesting to see on how this stuff all goes together with all the history of the sinking funds in Australia, and this is governed by the Strata Community Australia.